They'd demolished the first row of century-old apple trees in less than a day. That was how I learned the local HOA had trampled across my grandmother's orchard. When I drove up her gravel driveway early that Monday morning, I expected to find the same neat rows of fruit trees I'd known since I was a child, the orchard she'd painstakingly nurtured for decades. Instead, I arrived to the crash of bulldozers, the pounding of excavators, and the sight of downed trunks stacked like firewood. A battered billboard stood in the middle of what used to be our orchard's entry point, boasting, "Coming soon, Grandview Lane's private tennis complex." To say I was furious would be putting it mildly. I felt my pulse skyrocket, my fists tightening on the steering wheel. How had this happened without my knowledge? I'm Noah Carter, a property lawyer by profession but a grandson first and foremost. My grandmother, Evelyn Carter, planted most of these trees before I was even born, turning a simple patch of farmland into a thriving orchard that supplied the entire county with apples, peaches, and plums for decades. She lived on that orchard until her health began to fail, eventually moving into a smaller house closer to town so she could receive care. But she never sold the land. She trusted me, her only grandson, to safeguard it. I spent years building my legal reputation in a big city about 2 hours away, but my heart always led me back here, to this orchard. And now it appeared someone thought they could simply bulldoze generations of history in the name of luxury amenities. I parked near the orchard's old barn, what used to be our home base for harvesting. Jumping out, I confronted the nearest worker, who looked startled to see an outsider. Over the roar of machinery, I demanded to know who authorized this demolition. He shrugged, pointing me toward a row of construction trailers parked at the far edge of the property. I trudged across muddy tire tracks, my shoes sinking into the churned soil. Bits of shattered branches and crushed fruit littered the ground, a heartbreaking sight. Grandma would have been devastated to see her orchard reduced to this chaos. When I reached the trailers, I found a woman in a gray suit scanning documents at a portable desk. She turned at the sound of my footsteps, glancing me up and down with a slight sneer. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice sharpened by the shriek of heavy equipment behind us. I introduced myself, explaining that I was Evelyn Carter's grandson, and that this orchard was private property, not up for public or corporate development. She arched an eyebrow. "I'm Jennifer Mills, president of the Grandview Lane Homeowners Association," she replied. "As far as we're concerned, we have every legal right to be here. This land now falls under our updated community boundary, which includes provisions for a tennis complex." Her calm, condescending tone made my blood boil. "That's impossible," I snapped, barely controlling my temper. "My grandmother never sold to any HOA. Show me whatever documents you claim to have, because I guarantee there's a mistake, unless you're forging signatures." Ms. Mills gave a tight-lipped smile, retrieving a binder thick with papers. She flipped to a set of forms that looked official at a glance, complete with my grandmother's name in shaky handwriting at the bottom. "Here you go," she said. "She sold the orchard for a fair sum, on record with the county. If you have any objections, feel free to file them through official channels." I stared at the so-called contract. The signature looked suspiciously off. Even though my grandmother's handwriting had grown unsteady with age, she'd always looped her cursive E in a distinctive way. This signature was missing that flourish. My pulse hammered with outrage. "I'm telling you this is fraudulent," I said, glaring at Miss Mills. She shrugged, flipping the binder shut. "Then take us to court. But we have all the permits we need, and we're on a tight schedule. Our contractors plan to finish leveling these trees by the end of the month. Have a nice day." With that, she turned her back on me, returning to her phone calls as if I were a mere inconvenience. I stormed back to my car, my mind swirling with questions, fury mixed with heartbreak. The orchard that shaped my childhood memories was being sliced open by dozers, turning cherished farmland into the site of an exclusive tennis center for wealthy HOA members. I would not let that stand. They had no idea who they'd just provoked. Yes, I was a grandson first, but I was also a highly respected property lawyer, known for dismantling shady real estate deals. Over the years, I'd built a formidable reputation in multiple states, challenging corporate developers and winning. If Ms. Mills and her HOA had orchestrated some back-alley scheme, they'd just walked headlong into a legal battle they would regret. Without delay, I drove straight to the county records office, seeking any official transaction logs. The clerk, a timid woman in her 30s, typed my grandmother's name into her system. "Strange," she muttered, brow furrowed. "The orchard deed transfer was recorded about 4 months ago. The seller's signature is on file, but the notary stamp looks outdated." She rotated the screen for me to see. Indeed, the notary's commission had expired years prior. I felt a spark of hope. This wasn't just an error, it was likely a forgery or a fraudulent filing. "May I have copies of everything?" I asked. She agreed, printing them out while glancing at me uncertainly. "I hope you get to the bottom of this," she said. "I've heard rumors the Grandview Lane HOA has been expanding aggressively, but I never expected it'd reach this orchard." Armed with these suspect documents, I called my grandmother. She picked up on the second ring, her voice softened by age but still carrying a glint of her old feistiness. When I mentioned the orchard, she fell silent. Then, in a trembling voice, she insisted she'd never signed any contract with an HOA. "That orchard is your legacy, Noah," she said, fighting back tears. "I would never give it away." My heart clenched. "Don't worry, Grandma. I'll fix this. Just hang tight." That evening, I locked myself in my small home office, combing through property law references and forging connections between local statutes and the questionable documents. My instincts told me Miss Mills had bribed or colluded with someone in the county's permitting office, ensuring the orchard rezoning slid by unnoticed. But speculation wasn't enough. I needed a bulletproof legal strategy. I typed furiously, drafting a preliminary injunction request to halt all orchard demolition. If I could get a judge to sign it, the HOA would be forced to stop all construction until the court resolved ownership. Time was against me, though. Every day more of the orchard was being hacked apart. The next morning, I filed the injunction papers at the county courthouse. The staff told me it might take 2 weeks for the hearing date. That was standard procedure. 2 weeks? The orchard wouldn't survive that long if Ms. Mills stayed on schedule. Furious but undeterred, I started calling every local official I knew. Unfortunately, my network here was weaker than in the big city. Most of my major cases had been out of state, but a few old classmates from high school worked in local law enforcement or county administration. With their help, I fast-tracked an appointment with a sympathetic judge for an emergency hearing in 5 days. It was still too long for my liking, but better than 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Miss Mills wasted no time pushing forward. Fences sprang up around sections of orchard, and the once lush farmland looked more like a war zone each passing day. I visited the site regularly, documenting everything with my phone's camera. Each time, security guards tried to shoo me away, claiming I was trespassing on HOA property. The gall of that claim set me on edge. But I never lost my composure. I simply repeated, "We'll see about that in court," and kept filming. When I posted some footage online showing bulldozers flattening rows of young peach trees, outrage rippled through local social media. People were horrified at the destruction of such a beloved orchard. Ms. Mills remained silent to the public, presumably relying on her lawyers or her political connections to shield her from backlash. I found an unlikely ally in the form of an investigative journalist named Trevor King, who worked for a mid-sized newspaper in the next county over. He got wind of the orchard controversy through my social media posts, contacting me for a deeper interview. I gave him the background: my grandmother's orchard, the suspect's signatures, the outdated notary stamp. His eyes lit up at the mention of potential fraud. "If you can prove that Ms. Mills or her associates faked those documents," he said, "this could be huge. The public loves a David versus Goliath story." I didn't care about media attention for myself, but I knew that shining a spotlight on the HOA's unethical practices could help slow their momentum. The more heat Ms. Mills felt, the more likely she'd make a misstep. During this time, I also visited my grandmother regularly, updating her on the situation. She was distraught to see photos of the orchard's devastation. Each broken branch felt like a personal wound to her. "I hope you give them hell, Noah," she whispered once, tears in her eyes. That simple sentence stoked my resolve. Grandma had sacrificed so much to keep that orchard thriving. even after Grandpa passed away. I couldn't bear the thought of letting her down. When the day of the emergency hearing finally arrived, I walked into the courtroom with a stack of evidence. The fraudulent contract, the questionable notary stamp, even old orchard survey maps I dug up from Grandma's attic. Ms. Mills sat on the opposite side, her expression annoyingly confident, flanked by two polished attorneys. They argued that the orchard sale was legitimate, that my grandmother had been fully informed, and that the orchard itself was within the boundaries the HOA was permitted to develop. My turn came to present my arguments, and I didn't hold back. I attacked the forged signature with the intensity of a hawk diving for prey, highlighting the mismatch in notary records, the fact that my grandmother was never approached by any real estate agent, and how no official checks had ever reached her bank account. Midway through my presentation, Miss Mills' composure faltered. I could see her shifting in her seat, whispering frantically to one of her attorneys. The judge, a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes, listened carefully. After both sides spoke, the judge promised to issue a ruling on the injunction within 48 hours. In the meantime, she said, I strongly suggest you halt any further destruction of the orchard until this matter is resolved. Miss Mills' lawyers visibly bristled, but they had no choice except to feign compliance. Waiting for the judge's decision felt like an eternity. Meanwhile, the orchard remained partly fenced, though the bulldozers sat idle. Journalists hovered outside the orchard's gates, snapping photos of the half-demolished landscape. A wave of public sympathy turned in my favor. Local articles described me as a renowned property lawyer fighting for family heritage. Ms. Mills, on the other hand, gained a reputation for being a cold-hearted developer, brushing aside tradition for a tennis complex. She fired back in interviews, claiming the orchard was on the verge of bankruptcy and that she was rescuing the land from ruin, which was absurd, but it was all she had. At last, the judge's ruling arrived. My injunction was granted. Ms. Mills and the HOA were barred from further orchard destruction pending a full trial on the matter of ownership. The relief I felt was immeasurable, but the fight was far from over. If Ms. Mills had bribed any county officials or manipulated records, there was still a chance she could wriggle through legal loopholes. I needed more concrete proof that the sale was illegitimate. My next move was to find the notary whose stamp appeared on the fraudulent papers. A bit of detective work led me to a retired notary living in a quiet suburb who'd had the same official stamp once upon a time. She confirmed that her commission had indeed expired years ago, and she insisted she never notarized anything for Evelyn Carter. This was the smoking gun I needed. With the retired notary's affidavit in hand, I marched straight to the district attorney's office, demanding a fraud investigation. The DA's staff seemed intrigued, if cautious, especially when I presented them with the orchard's historical significance and the suspicious timeline of documents. They promised to look into it. Meanwhile, I built up my civil case as the official trial date loomed closer. A key moment came when Ms. Mills tried to pivot her strategy. She approached me through a mutual acquaintance, requesting a private meeting. Intrigued, I agreed to meet at a neutral location, a small conference room in the town's civic center. She arrived alone, face tight with apprehension, though she tried to hide it behind professional charm. Let's cut to the chase, she said, sitting across the table from me. The HOA is willing to negotiate a settlement. We'll pay you or your grandmother a significant sum, plus lifetime membership benefits, if you drop all claims and let the tennis complex be completed. After all, it's nearly halfway done. I stared at her, the audacity of that offer almost making me laugh. You bulldozed half an orchard that's been in my family for generations, and your solution is hush money? Ms. Mills kept her composure, though her eyes flared with annoyance. It's called a win-win scenario. People in this community love tennis. Your orchard, what's left of it, would still get some partial preservation. We'll even name a corner of it after your grandmother. I'm sure she'd appreciate the tribute. The nerve of that suggestion! My anger flared, but I kept my voice steady. My grandmother isn't interested in tributes from those who destroyed her life's work. The orchard isn't for sale. The orchard was never for sale. and once the courts see the extent of your fraud, your tennis complex is going to be dismantled." Ms. Mills' mouth tightened, revealing the faintest flicker of panic. "I see. You're determined to go the hard route," she said quietly. "Just remember, property battles can drag on for years. Your orchard might fall into total ruin by the time you get a final judgment." She stood, smoothing her suit jacket with trembling hands. "Think it over, Mr. Carter. This is bigger than your grandmother's orchard." I watched her leave, feeling a mix of disgust and grim satisfaction. Clearly, she was trying to hedge her bets. She must have realized her situation was precarious. If she truly believed her case was airtight, she wouldn't have offered me a buyout. That meant I was gaining ground. Over the next few weeks, my attorneys and I prepared meticulously for the trial. We deposed county clerks, surveyed the orchard's boundaries with professional drones, and compiled a timeline that laid out how Ms. Mills likely manipulated certain officials or documents to annex the orchard into HOA territory. The local news outlets fanned the flames, painting me as a champion for small landowners threatened by powerful HOA. But Ms. Mills wasn't done. On the morning I was set to finalize some key documents with my legal team, I woke to find bright orange violation notices plastered all over my grandmother's orchard fences, signed by the Grandview Lane HOA. They cited unapproved structures and failure to maintain community standards. The gall was almost comical. This orchard wasn't even legally in their community, yet they were slapping fines on us. I saw it for what it was, a tactic to harass us, to make me fold under the mounting pressure. The exact opposite reaction bubbled up in me. If Ms. Mills thought intimidation would work, she'd clearly overlooked the fact that property law was my battlefield. In a stroke of good timing, the district attorney's office decided to formally investigate Ms. Mills for fraud. Word on the street was that one of Ms. Mills's own staffers had come forward, confessing they witnessed the forging of my grandmother's signature. This staffer claimed Ms. Mills dictated how the signature should look, even referencing old archived files for authenticity. That was the final puzzle piece. The DA's investigators raided the HOA's local office, seizing computers and files. The news cameras captured Ms. Mills rushing out of the building, face flushed, refusing to answer reporters' questions. My phone lit up with calls from journalists wanting my comment. I kept it simple, saying I trusted the justice system to do its job. By the time the civil trial date arrived, Ms. Mills looked far less confident. I recalled a hush in the courtroom as the judge took her seat, scanning the packed gallery of onlookers. On one side sat Ms. Mills's battered legal team. On the other side, my own small but formidable crew of attorneys, plus me at the center. We started with opening statements. Ms. Mills' lawyers tried to spin a narrative that my grandmother knowingly sold the orchard, that the orchard was too large for a single family to manage, and that we were trying to back out of a fair deal. It sounded hollow, especially when pitted against the avalanche of evidence I presented. The suspicious notary stamp, the discrepancy in official records, the staffer's sworn testimony about forging a signature, and the proven timeline that left no doubt Ms. Mills had orchestrated a sham deal. When Ms. Mills took the stand, her confident facade cracked under cross-examination. My lead counsel pressed her on the mismatch between my grandmother's known signature and the contract on record. Ms. Mills stammered, claiming she'd never noticed the irregularities. She tried to shift blame onto some third-party broker, but she had no receipts or credible testimony to back that up. The judge's patience wore thin. On the third day of the trial, the staffer who had turned whistleblower testified against Ms. Mills, describing in detail how Ms. Mills guided them to practice forging Evelyn Carter's name, pointing out letters that needed to be shaped more convincingly. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Ms. Mills sank lower in her seat, looking like a trapped animal. Finally, the day arrived for closing arguments. My legal team hammered home the fact that a legitimate property transfer must have a valid signature, a current notary, and a verified payment. Ms. Mills' entire narrative crumbled under the weight of contradictory evidence. The judge retired to deliberate, leaving the court in tense anticipation. Less than an hour later, she returned with a decisive ruling. The orchard sale was null and void. The Grandview Lane HOA had committed fraud, and an immediate injunction was placed on all development related to their tennis complex. The orchard remained ours, free and clear. Ms. Mills faced not only the civil ruling but also looming criminal charges from the DA's ongoing investigation. Relief flooded me, followed by an overwhelming sense of vindication for Grandma. The orchard, battered but not defeated, would survive. But the story didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, the county demanded Ms. Mills remove all construction equipment and restore the orchard land to its prior state. She had no means to protest. Public sentiment was firmly on my family's side. Though many of the old trees were destroyed, some pockets of the orchard remained intact, enough to rebuild if we put in the time and resources. I plan to hire horticultural experts to see how best to rejuvenate the soil, replant trees, and salvage the orchard's legacy. My grandmother cried tears of joy when I told her the outcome, hugging me like I was still a little boy, holding her hand through the orchard rows. "I always knew you'd protect our land, Noah," she said, voice trembling with gratitude. "I just didn't realize how bad those people would be." That moment made all the sleepless nights and gut-wrenching days worth it. She insisted on visiting the orchard once the worst of the debris was cleared. When she did, her frail figure stood among the stumps and piles of uprooted roots, tears glinting in her eyes. Still, there was determination in her expression, like she believed the orchard could rise again, just as she had from every hardship. As for Ms. Mills, her meltdown was swift and dramatic. The fraud charges stuck. She was forced to resign from her position as HOA president under a swirl of scandal. A new, more ethical board took over, distancing themselves from her misdeeds. They issued a formal apology to my family, though it felt like a flimsy gesture after the devastation they'd caused. The district attorney's office pursued Ms. Mills, and last I heard she was negotiating a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial. The once grand plan for a tennis complex ended up as a black mark on the HOA's reputation. A cautionary tale about cutting corners and forging documents to expedite big projects. A few local residents in the Grandview Lane community reached out to me, apologizing on behalf of the HOA. They said they'd had no clue Ms. Mills was forging signatures to annex property. Some of them had even invested money in the tennis complex, hoping it would boost property values. I didn't hold it against them personally. They too were misled. However, I made it clear that the orchard was not up for negotiation, now or ever. As months passed, the orchard slowly returned to a state of possibility. Where Ms. Mills had ripped out beloved apple and peach trees, I planted new saplings. I enlisted local volunteers, even some school children, to help with replanting days. The orchard's rebirth became a symbol of resilience in the county. My grandmother, though she couldn't manage strenuous labor, supervised from a folding chair in the shade, offering advice on irrigation and spacing. The future orchard might take years to flourish, but we had time. The orchard was ours to nurture, safe from rapacious developers. One bright afternoon, as we finished a round of planting new rows, my phone buzzed with a call from a major news outlet. They wanted to interview me about the orchard's comeback, how a renowned property lawyer had exposed an HOA's corruption and salvaged a family legacy. I politely agreed, seeing it as a final chance to share the orchard's story with the world. When the reporter arrived, I walked her through the orchard, showing where the old stumps stood beside new seedlings. She filmed me standing next to a half-grown tree, the orchard's rolling hills stretching behind me. "What do you want people to learn from this?" she asked, microphone held out. I paused, looking across the land my grandmother had loved so fiercely. "That some things are worth fighting for," I said, heart pounding. "And no matter how powerful your opponents may seem, if you hold on to what's right and have a little knowledge of the law, they really have no idea who they're dealing with." The interview aired on local television and online platforms, generating renewed interest in the orchard's revival. Donations and volunteer offers poured in from people who believed in preserving green spaces amid sprawling developments. Even though the orchard was nowhere near its old glory, the community support filled me with renewed energy. Each weekend, small groups would gather to help with weeding, watering, or simply cheering us on. My grandmother's orchard had evolved from a personal heritage into a collective symbol of standing up to corruption and forging a path forward, even after destruction. In the aftermath, some folks asked if I planned to remain in the big city or move permanently near the orchard. I'd grown accustomed to the fast-paced environment of high-stakes property law, but part of me longed to stay close and watch those new saplings grow. Grandma was in her twilight years, needing companionship, and the orchard, in its wounded but hopeful state, called to me like a cherished friend needing help. I found a compromise, splitting my time between a smaller law office I opened in the local town and occasional trips to the city for major cases. My specialized reputation meant I could choose clients more selectively, focusing on cases that aligned with my sense of justice. Occasionally, I caught wind of Ms. Mills' situation. She'd lost her high-paying HOA job, faced legal repercussions for forgery, and ended up selling her upscale home to cover mounting legal fees. Some might say it was poetic justice. I never relished her downfall, though. I simply took it as proof that lying and deceit might grant short-term victories, but eventually the truth and the law catches up. Looking back on it all, I realized the orchard's near destruction had also been a catalyst for its renewal. With each replanting, each small sign of life returning, I felt a profound connection to my grandmother's legacy. The orchard's story had become something bigger than one family's fight. It was a testament to standing up for what's right, no matter how intimidating the opposition. For every bulldozer Ms. Mills unleashed, the orchard found new supporters willing to roll up their sleeves. For every legal obstacle, I found renewed determination in the memory of my grandmother's quiet sacrifices. Though the orchard might never look exactly the same, it will remain in the Carter family for generations to come, barring any unforeseen disasters. I have dreams of expanding beyond apples and peaches, maybe adding a small section for grapes or a greenhouse for experimental crops. Grandma always liked the idea of welcoming school kids on field trips, so perhaps I'll formalize that once everything is stable. The orchard can serve as a living classroom, teaching the importance of agriculture and showing that farmland is not just a placeholder for tennis courts or commercial expansions. Whenever a newcomer to the area asks me how the orchard survived, I share the short version of the story. An overconfident HOA tried to claim land that wasn't theirs. They messed with the wrong orchard. If they press for details, I'll tell them about Miss Mills, the forged documents, and how we took her to court and won. Yet I always emphasize the bigger lesson. Even in a system rife with corruption and big money influences, a steadfast commitment to truth can prevail. And yes, it helps if you happen to be a property lawyer who knows every trick in the book. My grandmother gave me a legacy that was more than mere acreage. She gave me a sense of purpose and moral grounding. She taught me that family land isn't just real estate. It's living heritage, a piece of history that deserves respect. In the end, the orchard breathes again. The tennis complex is a distant memory, an unfinished slab that was ripped out and hauled away by court order. On special weekends, I catch my grandmother seated on the porch of the old farmhouse we maintained at the orchard's edge. She watches the new trees swaying in the breeze. She smiles whenever she sees me approach. We don't speak much in those moments. Her heart condition tires her out quickly. But we don't need words. The orchard stands as proof that we overcame the unimaginable. And I stand as proof that no matter how unstoppable an HOA or corporation might seem, sometimes they truly have no idea who they're dealing with until it's too late. That's the story of how one unscrupulous group learned a harsh lesson about forging signatures, burying truths, and underestimating the power of a determined grandson who also happened to be a renowned property lawyer. The orchard is still healing, yes, but each new seedling is a reminder that nature, when given a chance, can be reborn stronger than ever. And if Ms. Mills or anyone else tries a stunt like this again, well, let's just say they won't get very far now that the orchard's real guardian is home.